The human student was caught writing in an ancient extinct language, the one not so dead yet. The formal verification process took 9 months. That was fast, by academic standards. Under normal circumstances, a claim of this magnitude, a living linguistic connection between two species, spanning 4,000 years, suggesting a shared cultural ancestor, would have taken years of careful study, formal challenges, peer review cycles, and enough committee meetings to fill a small library. But the evidence was, as Prath eventually admitted in writing, overwhelming. And there were people on both sides of the finding who did not want to wait. The Marin Council of Elders requested access to the full recordings within the first week. 3 of the elders wept during the audio playback of Jiwan and Hyun speaking. One of them, an old woman named Elder Sova, who had dedicated her life to Meren cultural preservation, listened to the recordings 4 times in a row, and then sat in silence for 2 hours. When her assistant asked if she was all right, she said that she was trying to memorize the sound. She said she had waited her whole life to hear it, and she did not want to rush. On the human side, word spread through the colony networks faster than the academic community would have liked. Settlement Barun heard the news before the official announcement was made. Someone talked, as someone always does, and the response was immediate and warm and chaotic in the way that small, tight communities respond to large things. Oran, Jiwon's grandmother, was apparently the last to be told. Hyun's family had known for 2 days before anyone got around to calling her, partly because nobody was sure how to start the conversation. Jiwon eventually did it herself, over a comm call, and kept the details brief and clear. The language they spoke was the ancestral tongue of another people, and those people had been looking for it for 4,000 years, and they had found it in her grandmother's kitchen. There was a long silence on the line. Then Oren said, in the old tongue, something that Jiwon later translated for the Academy record as, "Of course it was in the kitchen. Where else would anything important be?" The formal ceremony of linguistic reunification was held 8 months after that, on neutral academic ground, a space station positioned between Marin and human-occupied territory, chosen specifically because it belonged to neither side and therefore belonged to both. The station had been converted for the occasion, its largest hall set with long tables, hung with banners in both Marin formal colors and the warm reds and yellows of the human colony flags, its environmental systems carefully calibrated to a temperature and air mix that both species would find comfortable. Jiwon and Hyun were there. Veth was there. Dresova and Rathak and Prath were there. Dr. Ara had been deeply involved in the preparation, and stood near the back of the hall during the ceremony, watching with the expression of a person who has worked hard on something, and is now watching it exist without her. And Oren was there. Getting Oren there had required a small amount of effort, and a larger amount of stubbornness. She was 73 years old, and had not left Settlement Baran in 11 years, and her initial response to the invitation had been that she did not see why old women needed to travel halfway across the sector for other people to look at them. Jiwon had pointed out that it was not about being looked at, it was about being known. Oran had sat with that for a day, and then packed a bag. She was a small woman, thinner than Jiwon, with white hair cut short, and hands that were roughened from years of work. She walked slowly, but stood straight. When she entered the ceremony hall, and saw the Marin elders for the first time, really saw them, not on a screen, but in person. 4 of them, in their formal robes, standing at the front of the room, she stopped walking. Elder Sova stepped forward. They stood facing each other for a moment. 2 old women, 1 Marin, 1 human. Between them, 4,000 years of separation, and an unbroken thread of language that had survived, because one side had kept it alive without knowing, and the other had kept the memory of it without giving up. She spoke in the old tongue, not the reconstructed academic version, but as naturally as she could manage from the recordings, with the care of someone speaking a language they have studied but not grown up in. Her pronunciation was formal, careful, and not quite right, but it was close enough. She said, "The table is wide enough." Oren's face did what Jiwon had predicted it would do. Her eyes filled. She did not try to stop it. She stood there and let herself be moved, in the way people do when they have lived long enough to understand that certain moments deserve to be fully felt. She answered in the old tongue, the words coming out of her the way they always had, easily, naturally, without effort. The voice of someone who had spoken this language every day of her life without ever being asked why. She said, "We kept your place at the table." Nobody who did not understand the language needed a translation. The meaning was in the room, regardless. What followed was not a formal academic exercise. It was something more complicated and more human, or perhaps more accurately, more alive. Over the course of the next 3 days, the tables were full. Marin scholars sat with human colony elders. Jiwon worked side by side with Veth, going through the full fragment catalog, filling in gaps, correcting old guesses, adding context that no fragment had ever been able to provide. Hyun sat with a group of young Marin students and taught them casual phrases, the everyday language, the kitchen language, the language for jokes and complaints, and the particular word Oran used when something smelled almost ready. There was laughter. There was a great deal of food, prepared according to recipes that both cultures brought to the table. And there turned out to be significant overlap in the spices. Rethak sat at the edge of one of the long tables on the second evening and watched all of it. He had a cup of something warm in front of him, and his notes open on his datapad, though he had stopped writing in them some time ago. There was too much to look at. He watched Oren and Sova sitting together at the far end of the table, talking with Dr. Ara, helping to bridge the gaps that Oren's formal galactic standard couldn't quite cover. He watched Jiwon demonstrating the correct pronunciation of something for a young Marin scholar who kept laughing at herself when she got it wrong. He watched Hyun explaining, with hand gestures, the difference between two words that sounded similar but meant very different things, and the group around him leaning in to understand. He thought about what it meant, all of it. Not academically, not in the language of papers and findings and formal records, just what it meant. A language had survived because people had loved it, not consciously, not as an act of preservation, not because anyone had decided it was important to keep. It had survived because it was beautiful and useful, and it made the food smell right, and it was the voice of grandmothers, and the words for things that mattered. It had survived because people had kept talking, kept teaching, kept passing it across tables, to children who did not know they were carrying something 4,000 years old. And somewhere, on the other side of the galaxy, another people had held the empty shape of it, the fragments, the ruins, the echo, and had not stopped believing that the shape had once been full. Both sides had been faithful to it, in their own way, and faithfulness, it turned out, was enough. Near the end of the evening, Elder Sova asked Oren, through Dr. Ara, the question that had been in the room since the ceremony began. She asked it simply, without formality. Why had the humans kept speaking it for so long? What had made them hold on to it, across all those generations, across migration and hardship, and the 1,000 practical pressures that make old things get left behind? Oren looked at her. She considered the question with the unhurried manner of someone who has never felt the need to answer quickly, when a slow answer would be more honest. Then she said, in the old tongue, something short. Dr. Ara translated it. It was a beautiful way to say I love you. Why would we stop? Sova looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, the way people nod when they have heard the right answer to a question they have been asking for a very long time. Rethak wrote it down. He thought it was probably the most important sentence in his 31 years of notes. Outside the station's wide observation windows, the stars were the same as they had always been, indifferent and vast and endlessly old. But inside, around long tables full of food and noise, and two peoples finding their way back to each other across 4,000 years of silence, something that had been marked as lost was being carefully, joyfully, permanently unmarked. The language was alive. It had always been alive. It had just been waiting for someone to come looking. The human student was caught writing in an ancient, extinct language, the one not so dead yet. It was Counselor Veth who made the connection first, though he did not say it out loud right away. He sat with it for a full day, alone in the small reading room the Academy had given him, before he brought it to the others. That was his way. He had learned in 40 years of academic work that there is a difference between knowing something and being ready to say it. He wanted to be ready. The connection came from the pronunciation. Jiwan and Hyun spoke the old tongue with the natural drift that any living language carries over thousands of years. Certain sounds had softened, certain consonants had blended together. The rhythm had shifted in places, the way a river shifts its path over time, without ever stopping being a river. These changes were expected. They were, in fact, evidence of life. Dead languages did not change because nothing was left to change them. But underneath all of that drift, underneath 4,000 years of kitchens and family arguments and bedtime stories and quiet conversations over food, the deep structure was the same. The bones of it, the way the language held its verbs, the way it marked time and relationship and possession, the specific music of how it moved from one thought to the next. Veth knew that music. He had spent 4 decades learning to hear it in fragments. He sat in the reading room with the audio recordings of Jiwan and Hyun speaking, and he played them against the oldest archived fragments in the database, the ones recovered from hull debris, scratched into metal by people who had known, on some level, that their world was ending. He played them side by side, and he listened. And then he understood. Aldrich 7 was not from an unverified origin system, as the database classification had always stated. The reason the origin had never been confirmed was because the researchers who had cataloged the fragments had been looking for a civilization, for ruins, for infrastructure, for the marks of a settled people. What they had not considered was that the people they were looking for had not settled. They had moved. A long time ago, before the collapse, a portion of the population had already left. Not as refugees. Earlier than that. Travelers, explorers, the kind of people who leave before there is a reason to, because leaving is simply what they do. And those travelers, scattered, small in number, carrying nothing heavy, had found humanity. Not in the way the old stories described first contact. Not with ships and diplomats and formal negotiations. Quietly. On the edges of early human expansion. In the places where the records were thin, and the colony ships were small, and the settlers were too busy surviving to write everything down. A people without a home, meeting a people who were still finding theirs. And somewhere in that meeting, in the sharing of food and fire, and the slow, careful work of learning to understand each other, the language had crossed over, had settled into human households, and human children, and human grandmothers cooking in kitchens on small colony worlds at the edge of mapped space. Veth came to the council the next morning and laid it out. Quietly, without drama, in the measured way of a person who has been patient for a very long time and is no longer in a hurry. The room was very still when he finished. Council head Drezova sat with her hands pressed flat on the table. Dr. Ara had her eyes closed. Rethak looked at the data Veth had brought, the cross-referenced analysis, the acoustic comparison, the linguistic genealogy mapped out in careful lines across a large display panel, and felt the quiet enormity of it settle into his chest. Prath was the first to speak. "You're saying," he said slowly, "that the Marin and humanity share a linguistic ancestor." "I am saying more than that," Veth replied. I am saying that the people who carried Aldrich 7 out of the collapse, the ones we never found because we were looking in the wrong places, they did not simply survive. They merged. They became part of the human story without anyone recording that it had happened. And the language they carried survived, because the humans who learned it loved it enough to keep it. He paused, and then he said something that no one in the room expected. The Marin people have been in mourning for 4,000 years. We have held ceremonies every generation to mark the death of our ancestral tongue. We have written elegies for it. We have taught our children that the original language, the one our founders spoke, the one our earliest history was recorded in, was gone, irretrievable. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that had weight. It was not gone. It was in a kitchen on Settlement Baroon. It was being spoken over dinner by a woman named Oran to her granddaughter. Drisova made a sound that Rithak could not quite categorize. He looked at her and saw that her expression had broken open in a way he had never seen on her face before, and he had known her for 11 years. She was not a woman who showed feeling easily. Whatever she was feeling now was too much to keep contained, and she was not trying very hard to contain it. We need to verify this fully before any formal announcement, Pratt said, with the instinct of a careful academic. Cross-reference all known Marin linguistic history. Confirm the pre-collapse migration records. Of course, Veth said. He did not seem bothered by the caution. But I have been working with these fragments for 40 years, and I am telling you, I know this language. I know it the way I know my own name. And what those two children speak is it. Changed by time, yes, worn smooth in some places, rough in others, but it is ours. He looked around the table. It came home. Later that afternoon, Jiwon and Hyun were brought back to the conference room and told, carefully, gently, with Dr. Ara translating, and Veth sitting across from them in the same way he had sat before, quiet and deliberate, what had been found, what it meant. Hyun's face went through several expressions very quickly. Jiwon's face did not. She sat still and listened to all of it, and did not speak until Veth had finished. Then she said, in Galactic Standard, very quietly, "My grandmother is going to cry." "Yes," Veth said, "I imagine she will." "She's not sad when she cries," Jiwon said. "I just want you to know that. She cries when things are too good to just smile at." Veth looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in the old tongue, something short, 3 words, and his voice was not the measured voice of a scholar. It was the voice of someone saying something true. Jiwon looked at him, and then, without hesitation, she answered him in the same language. Rethak did not understand the exchange. He looked at Dr. Ara, who had her hand over her mouth. He raised his eyebrows. She shook her head slightly, the way people do when they do not want to speak, because speaking would break something. Later, he asked her what had been said. She told him that Veth had said, "I was looking for you." And Jiwon had answered, "We were here." The human student was caught writing in an ancient extinct language, the one not so dead yet. On the 3rd day of the investigation, Counselor Veth asked if he could speak to Jiwon alone. Not alone in the strict sense. Dr. Ara stayed as a translator and witness, and Rethak remained in the room because the council had asked him to document the proceedings. But Veth had requested that the larger group of scholars and council heads step out, and Dresova had agreed without argument. She had seen the look on the old man's face. They all had. Veth sat across the table from Jiwon, with his hands folded in front of him. He was old even by Marin standards, his gray skin marked by the deeper creases that came with age, his eyes a pale amber that had faded slightly from what Rethak imagined they had once been. He had a stillness to him that most people develop only after spending a great many years sitting alone with difficult questions. "I want to understand," Veth said, and Dr. Ara translated into Galactic Standard, "how it was passed down. Not the fact of it. I understand the chain. grandmother to grandchild. I want to understand the way. What did it feel like, learning it? Where were you when you learned it? Jiwon was quiet for a moment. She was not a girl who rushed to fill silences, which Rethak had noticed before, and appreciated more each time. In the kitchen, she said finally. Mostly in the kitchen. My grandmother, her name is Oron. She would be cooking, and she would just talk. She never sat me down and said, "Now I am going to teach you a language." She just talked while she cooked, and after a while I started understanding, and after a while longer, I started talking back. She always said it was the best language for talking about food. That galactic standard didn't have the right words for the way something smells when it's almost ready. Veth said something in a low voice that Dr. Ara translated as, "That is true. The language has 17 distinct words for stages of heat and aroma in cooking. We know this from the fragments." Jiwon looked at him with something new in her eyes. "You know the fragments?" "I have spent 40 years with the fragments," Veth said. "They are small pieces, hull inscriptions, a few lines carved into metal, enough to know the shape of the language, but not enough to hear it." He paused. "I have tried many times to imagine what it sounded like when it was spoken, when it was alive." He looked at her. "And all this time, it was alive." Jiwon nodded slowly. "My grandmother says it's the language for things that matter. She uses standard for shopping and paperwork and talking to officials. She uses the old tongue for everything she actually means." Rethak wrote that down. He wasn't sure why, but it felt important to have it in the record, exactly as she had said it. Hyun had been brought back in by then and sat beside Jiwon. When Veth asked the same question of him, Hyun thought about it longer before answering. He had a different relationship with the language, he explained. His family was less fluent than Jiwon's. His grandfather had known it well, but his parents had only partial knowledge, enough to use certain phrases, certain expressions. He had learned more of it from Jiwon's family, from spending time at their home after school, listening to Oron talk while she cooked. "She never made me feel like a guest when she spoke it," Hyun said. "She just included me, like it was natural." Veth was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said something that Dr. Ara translated carefully, as though she wanted to make sure she got it right. "In our oldest fragments, there is a phrase. It appears 3 times in the corpus, which means it was likely common in daily use. We have translated it approximately as, 'The table is wide enough.' Our scholars believe it was an expression of welcome, an invitation to stay and eat. We were never certain." Jiwon's head came up. She looked at him steadily. "We still say that," she said. "My grandmother says it every time someone comes to the door. Every time. She says it in the old tongue, even when she says everything else in standard." Jiwon's voice was very even, but something in it had changed, a thickness that had not been there before. "I didn't know it was that old." The room held that moment for a while. What unfolded over the next several hours was less an interrogation and more something that did not have a clean academic word for it. Veth would mention a fragment, a phrase, a grammatical structure, a word whose meaning they had only guessed at, and Jiwon or Hyun would either confirm it, correct it, or expand it. Twice Jiwon said that what the scholars had translated was close but not quite right, and she explained the fuller meaning, and both times Veth wrote it down with the focused urgency of a man who has been waiting a long time to write something down. At one point, Dr. Ara set down her stylus and just listened. She forgot to translate for nearly 10 minutes. Nobody noticed until Rethak quietly cleared his throat. By late afternoon, they had covered approximately 40 of the known Aldrich 7 fragments. Jiwon and Hyun could confirm 36 of them from living knowledge. Of the remaining 4, 2 were confirmed as having changed significantly over time. The words existed, but their meanings had drifted. And 2 they had never heard at all, which Veth noted were likely formal or ceremonial terms that had not survived in casual everyday use. "We lost the ceremony," Jiwan said simply, when Veth explained this. "My grandmother says the same. She says the formal parts got left behind a long time ago because there were no ceremonies to use them in. But the language you need every day, that stays." "That is exactly what language does," Dr. Ara said softly, almost to herself. "It survives in the kitchen and the bedroom and the argument between family members. It dies in the temple and the courtroom when those institutions disappear." She looked at Jiwan. "Your people kept the part that mattered most." Jiwan shrugged, in the way young people shrug when they have not yet fully understood the weight of what they have done. "We just talked," she said. "We just kept talking." After the session ended and the room began to empty, Rethak stayed behind. He sat at the table and looked at his notes, pages of them, filled with things he had spent 31 years teaching as closed history, now quietly reopened by a 17-year-old who had learned a dead language in a kitchen. He thought about all the things in the academic record that were labeled extinct, lost, ended, gone. He wondered how many of them were simply somewhere quiet, being spoken over dinner by people who had not heard yet that the rest of the galaxy had stopped listening. It was a thought that sat uncomfortably with a career's worth of academic certainty. Outside in the corridor, he heard Jiwan say something to Hyun in the old tongue. Hyun laughed, a short genuine laugh, and replied. Their footsteps faded down the hall. Rethak sat alone for a while longer, before he gathered his notes and went to find Veth. There was still a great deal more to understand. The human student was caught writing in an ancient extinct language, the one not so dead yet. The Academic Council of Vorn Prime did not move quickly on most things. It was made up of senior faculty and administrative heads from 11 different species, and getting 11 different species to agree on a meeting time, a room temperature, and an acceptable atmospheric composition alone could take the better part of a week. But when Rethak sent his report, with a high-priority flag and a scanned copy of Jiwan's paper attached, the council called an emergency session within 6 hours. That was unusual. In 31 years, Rethak had only seen an emergency session called twice. Once when a student had accidentally released a self-replicating study algorithm into the Academy's main data network, and once when a Drethani diplomat's child had been enrolled without proper documentation, and 3 governments got involved. Both times the situation had resolved quietly, after a lot of meetings and formal letters. He suspected this time would be different. The session was held in the upper conference chamber, a circular room with high ceilings, tall windows that looked out over Vorn Prime's pale yellow skyline, and a long table that could seat 20. By the time Rethak arrived, 12 people were already seated. He recognized the faces of the council heads and several visiting scholars who had apparently been contacted directly. At the far end of the table sat 2 humans, Jiwan, her hands flat on the table in front of her, and beside her her study companion and friend, a boy named Hyun. Hyun was 16, a year younger than Jiwan. He was from the same colony, Settlement Barun, and had arrived at the academy on the same transport. Where Jiwan was quiet and self-contained, Hyun was observant in a different way. He watched everything with the kind of careful attention that made people slightly uncomfortable without knowing why. He had a notebook open on the table in front of him. Rethak noticed that the notebook was already drawing eyes from the scholars seated nearby. Council head Dresova, a broad-shouldered Marin woman with dark gray skin and a formal academic robe, opened the session without preamble. She was one of the oldest members of the council, and had no patience for unnecessary ceremony. We are here to examine a linguistic anomaly reported by Professor Rethak during yesterday's written assessment, she said. The paper in question has been analyzed by the Academy's central database, cross-referenced with 3 external linguistic archives, and reviewed by 2 specialists brought in this morning. All 4 analyses returned the same partial match. Aldrich 7. The names settled over the room the way heavy things settle. A few of the scholars exchanged glances. One of them, a small Velith man named Academic Counselor Prath, leaned forward with an expression that was caught somewhere between disbelief and professional excitement. "That is not possible," Prath said flatly. "Aldrich 7 has been a closed file for 2 centuries. The last comprehensive study concluded that the language could not be reconstructed beyond the fragments we already have. There is simply not enough surviving material." "And yet," Dresova said, and slid the scanned paper down the table toward him. Prath picked it up. He read it. He read it again. He set it down very carefully and looked at Jiwon. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My grandmother taught me," Jiwon said, then looked back down at the paper. For the next 2 days, the investigation expanded in ways Rethak had not expected. 3 more linguists were brought in, 1 Kelvari, 1 human academic from the Federation's Cultural Studies Department, and 1 Marin elder who specialized in pre-collapse civilizations. Hyun's notebook was examined with his permission, and what the scholars found inside it deepened the situation considerably. The notebook was half full of text in the same script. Not copied exercises, but original writing, personal notes, a record of daily thoughts, written casually, in a language that had supposedly been dead for 4,000 years. When the human cultural specialist, a woman named Dr. Ara, asked Hyun to speak the language out loud, the room went very still. He spoke it easily, naturally, with the small hesitations and dropped sounds of someone speaking a language they learned at home rather than in a classroom. There was humor in it. His tone shifted in a way that clearly indicated a joke at one point, though no one in the room could understand what he said. Dr. Ara recorded everything and cross-referenced it with the audio fragments recovered from pre-collapse ship debris. The match was not perfect. 4,000 years of natural language drift had changed the pronunciation significantly, but the underlying structure was unmistakable. "This is the same language," she said very quietly. "Not a derivation, not a reconstruction. The same root system, the same grammatical framework. This has been spoken continuously. It did not die." The Marin elder, whose name was Counselor Veth, and who had spent 40 years of his life studying the Aldrich 7 fragments in academic isolation, sat without speaking for a very long time after that. Rethek watched him and felt something that he could not quite name. The old scholar's expression was unlike anything Rethek had seen on a Marin face. The Marin were generally composed people, reserved in public. Whatever Veth was feeling, it was too large for him to keep behind his eyes. "Can you ask them?" Veth said finally, directing his question at Dr. Ara without looking up from the paper in his hands. "How many people speak it? Among the humans, I mean. How many know this language?" Dr. Ara relayed the question. Jiwon and Hyun exchanged a brief glance. "I don't know exactly," Jiwon said. "Everyone in our family does. Most people on our settlement know at least some of it. Old people use it more. My grandmother uses it more than she uses standard." "Your settlement," Dresova said slowly. "How large is settlement Barun?" "About 4,000 people," Hyun said. Another silence. "And are there other settlements like yours?" Prath asked. "Other human communities that might also use this language?" "My grandmother always said that a lot of the older colony families kept the old tongue. She made it sound like it was common, normal, like keeping a family recipe." She paused. She would be upset if she heard people calling it extinct. Rethak looked at the paper again, the one that had started all of this. A student writing in an exam hall, thinking better in a language she had learned from her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother, in an unbroken line, going back to a time that the rest of the galaxy had written off as ended. He thought about the word extinct. He thought about what it actually meant. The last speaker gone, the last written record locked away in an archive. The door closed, and the key lost. He had used that word himself in lecture halls. He had taught it as a fact. He looked at Jiwon, who was answering Pratt's follow-up questions in a calm, matter-of-fact way, as if none of this was particularly surprising to her. As if she had always known this was just a thing her family did, like keeping certain dishes, or singing certain songs, or lighting candles on certain nights. 4,000 years. Not a fragment, not a ruin, a living thing, walking around in 17-year-olds from a small colony on the edge of the Federated Systems. The investigation was only 2 days old, and already Rethak had the distinct feeling that what they had found was much larger than anyone in that room was yet ready to say out loud. Outside the tall windows, Vorn Prime's yellow sky was beginning to darken into evening. Inside the conference chamber, nobody moved to leave. The human student was caught writing in an ancient extinct language, the one not so dead yet. The examination hall of Vorn Prime's Interstellar Academy was always quiet during the written assessment hours. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears, heavy, serious, full of the sound of stylus tips scratching against datasheets, and the soft hum of the environmental systems keeping the air at a breathable mix for 17 different species. The hall was large enough to seat 400 students at once, and on that particular morning it was nearly full. Professor Rethak moved between the rows slowly, as he always did. He was Kelvari, tall, pale-skinned, with 4 long arms that he kept folded behind his back when he walked. His eyes were wide and dark, designed by evolution to catch fine movement at great distances. He had been teaching galactic history and cultural linguistics at the Academy for 31 years. And in that time he had seen many things. Students cheating with hidden comm devices. Students sleeping with their eyes open. Once, a young Drethani had eaten his own exam paper in a panic. But he had never seen what he saw that morning. He was moving through the 3rd row when something made him slow down. It was not a sound. It was more like a feeling, the kind that comes when something familiar appears in an unexpected place. He stopped behind the human student in seat 37 and looked down at her paper. Her name was Jiwon. She was 17 years old, from a small human colony called Settlement Barun, located on the outer edge of the Federated Systems. She was not a remarkable student in the traditional sense. Her grades in science were average. Her marks in interspecies communication were decent, but not outstanding. She was quiet, kept to herself mostly, and her uniform was always slightly wrinkled, as if she had dressed in a hurry every single morning of her life. But what she was writing on that exam paper was not the answer to any question on the assessment. She was writing in a language Rethak had never seen before. He stood there for a long moment, just watching her hand move. The script was unlike anything in the standard academic database. The characters were angular at the edges, but curved in the middle, like someone had taken hard geometric shapes and softened them by hand. The lines had a rhythm to them, a visual rhythm, almost like music written out in symbols. She was not copying it carefully or drawing it with effort. She was writing it fast, naturally, the way a person writes in a language they have spoken their whole life. Rethak leaned slightly closer. His translator implant, embedded just behind his left ear, was one of the most advanced models available to Academy faculty. It could process and identify over 40,000 active languages and 6,000 catalogued extinct ones in real time. He had never once seen it fail. It was failing now. The small display on his wrist communicator, which mirrored the implant's output, showed a single blinking message in Galactic Standard. Language unidentified. No match found. He straightened up slowly. He looked at Jiwon. She had not noticed him standing behind her. She was still writing, her head slightly tilted, her dark hair falling over one shoulder. Whatever she was writing, she was completely absorbed in it. Her pen moved without hesitation, There were no crossouts, no pauses, no signs of someone trying to remember something. It flowed out of her like water. Rethak cleared his throat. Ji-won's hand stopped. She looked up and turned around. Her expression was calm at first, the natural expression of a student interrupted mid-thought. Then she saw where his eyes were directed, toward her paper, and something shifted in her face. Not guilt exactly, more like the look of someone who had just remembered they had left something out in the open that they had not planned to. "Student Ji-won," Rethak said, keeping his voice level. "What is this?" She looked at the paper, then back at him. "I was just thinking," she said. "I think better when I write in." She paused. "I was just writing some notes, to help me focus." "In what language?" he asked. She did not answer right away. She pressed her lips together briefly. "It's just something from home," she said. Rethak reached down and picked up the paper. He held it carefully, as though it might mean something important, though he did not yet know why he felt that way. He looked at the characters again. Up close, they were even more striking. There was an internal logic to them. He could feel it, even without understanding them. A structure, a grammar. This was not invented nonsense. This was not decorative drawing. This was a real language, built by real minds, with real rules behind every curve and angle. "I will need to take this," he said. Ji-won nodded. She did not protest. She did not look particularly worried either, which Rethak found strangely unsettling. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a clean datasheet, and began writing her actual exam answers. Rethak walked to the front of the hall, the confiscated paper held flat in one of his upper hands. He set it on his desk and placed a scanner over it, letting the Academy's central language database run a full analysis. He watched the scanner work. It was thorough. It cross-referenced living languages, trade dialects, regional scripts, dead languages, ceremonial inscriptions, pre-collapse texts, even fragments found on unmapped ruins. It took 4 minutes, which was unusually long. The result came back as a single line of text on his screen. Match status. Partial fragment correlation detected. Source designation. Aldrich 7. Classification. Extinct. Last recorded use. Approximately 4,200 years before present. Origin system. Unverified. Population status. Total extinction confirmed. Rethak sat down slowly in his chair. Aldrich 7 was not simply a forgotten language. It was one of the most studied cases of total linguistic death in the academic record. The civilization that had spoken it had been destroyed when its star collapsed ahead of predicted timelines. There had been no survivors, no diaspora, no recorded transfer of the language to any other culture. The only known samples were fragments found carved into debris fields and recovered hull pieces from ships that had been traveling away from the system at the time of the collapse. Scholars had spent decades trying to reconstruct it and had managed perhaps 15% of its full structure. What was on Ji-won's paper was not a fragment. It was complete, flowing, fully structured text. Paragraphs. Sentences with clear beginnings and ends. A language being used, not studied. Rethak sat with the paper in his hands for a long time after the examination hall emptied. Around him, other students filed out, chatting and stretching. Ji-won walked past his desk without stopping. She did not look at him. She shifted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and walked out the door like it was any other day. He looked at the paper again. Somewhere deep in 31 years of academic instinct, something told him that whatever this was, it was not small. It was not a mistake or a curiosity. Something old had just walked back through a door that everyone had agreed for 4,000 years was permanently closed. He picked up his communicator and called the academic council.